I'm 30 years of age and a married woman. My husband is Dr. Michael Gonen, a geologist, a good-natured man. I loved him. We met in Terra Sancta College 10 years ago. I was a first-year student at the Hebrew University in the days when lectures were still given in Terra Sancta College. This is how we met. One winter's day at 9 o'clock in the morning, I slipped coming downstairs. A young stranger caught me by the elbow. His hand was strong and full of restraint. He asked if he could take me to the cafeteria on the ground floor. My leg hurt. Terra Sancta College is a Christian convent, which was loaned to the Hebrew University after the 1948 war, when the buildings on Mount Scopus were cut off. It is a cold building. The corridors are tall and wide. I felt distracted as I followed this young stranger who was holding on to me. "Now, let's sit down," he said.
Welcome to The View from Mount Scopus, a podcast from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I am Gilad Halpern. You just heard the beginning of My Michael by Amos Oz, translated by Nicholas DeLange. It evokes a chance encounter in the chilly halls of Terra Sancta College, which, as you also heard, was loaned to the Hebrew University after 1948, when the university's own campus in Mount Scopus was cut off from the capital of the newly established State of Israel. For nearly 2 decades, the university led a strange, fragmented existence. Exiled from its mountaintop home and scattered throughout downtown Jerusalem. In this episode, we'll return to the post-war years, as the university was coming into its own as a truly Hebrew university. We'll explore its linguistic significance as an institute that made Hebrew its lingua franca from the very start, as well as how today's scholars are studying the language itself using tools that would have been unimaginable a century ago. But first, let's continue where we left off at Terra Sancta, at the very center of Jerusalem, where I have arranged to meet Dr. Marek Stern, the urban political geographer and expert Jerusalemite. What was Terra Sancta before?
Terra Sancta before was high school, English high school for Christian boys, which mostly were Arab in Jerusalem, yes. So they moved those functions there, and then a month later they signed up with Ratisbon Monastery, which is in Shmuel Hanagid Street near Old Betzalel, another empty monastery that was an orphan house, now became the new law faculty. Another monastery, the Italian monastery that still stands today in front of the president's house, became the site for natural sciences, chemistry, zoology, and etc. But that wasn't enough. They had to find more. So they still rented out private houses. Some of the lecturers still taught in their houses in Talbiya, in Rehavia. They received apartments and houses from the government functions that was responsible for all the evacuees' property, what was the Palestinian properties. So some former Palestinian houses now served as places either for teaching, but also to host lecturers from abroad that had to move to Israel to teach at the university. You can find those on King David Street and Mamila Street. Also in the Russian compound, the first department for medicine was located there on the Russian compound, and etc. So in 10 years they spread in almost 50 different locations all over the city.
What were the difficulties that entailed for university life?
It was very hard for the faculty and the administrations. They really suffered, and there's a lot of documents showing the frustration because those spaces were not adequate for teaching. They were either small, without furniture. You can't really teach in private houses. So lecturers really complained that it was humiliating and frustrating experience. They had to teach sometimes the same class 3 times in a row because the class wasn't big enough. The students had to run between classes, between those buildings in Jerusalem, and they never made it in time. So it was, for the university, it was a big challenge. But on the other hand, for the city, it was a great opportunity. Suddenly, you have the university, the students, the faculty coming down from this faraway mountain and integrated into urban space, using the restaurants, the services, renting apartments. Of course, they lived there before, but it really brought up together the university and the city.
What about the sciences, laboratories, and all the equipment that comes along with it? Teaching is one thing, but you need also physical infrastructure to do science.
Yeah, so some of the laboratories were on the roof of private houses in Talbiya, of some of the lecturers, and it was really difficult. It really hurt the activity of the university. Even more so, at the same time, the state demanded the university to broaden up, to open up BA. They had no BA. To open up new departments as law, sociology, economy that they didn't want to teach, but the state said you have to prepare the next generation of administration for the new country. You're the only academic institution in Israel. This is your role. So at the same time, they had no space. They expanded the amount of students 3 and 4 times, up to 54, 55. So it was very difficult.
And when did the idea to open the Givat Ram campus start?
So almost immediately, while they are relocating themselves in all those buildings and houses, they start to search for solutions. But the Senate of the university and the state had very different ideas of where should the new campus be. First of all, they couldn't admit in public that Mount Scopus is unavailable. It was a geopolitical issue, diplomatically. It took them time to talk about it upfrontly. So it had to be in secret, those kind of discussions. The Senate wanted a nearby campus in the city. There was a vacant hill in Talbiya, the site where the President House and Van Leer Institute is today, called Carmel Ruhban. In Arabic, it's the orchard of the monk, which was available and was really convenient for them because most of the faculty lived in Talbiya and Rehavia anyway. But the government, especially Ben Gurion, said no. We don't want you to be a city university. We want it to be national university. And Ben Gurion actually wanted to take out the university out of the city and locate it near Enkarem Tsuba, on a mountain it's called Har Cheret. It's near the castle today. And the Senate really stood up on his back legs, as you say, and said, no way. Mount Scopus was far enough for us. Now you want us to travel on bus a whole hour, because it was quite far away back then, to go to this hill. Ben Gurion said, no, you have to mend the border, the Jordanian border. This is a national mission, and etc. So there was a big struggle, a big conflict between them.
That Ben Gurion was very much involved in.
Ben Gurion was very much involved there, and he fighted not in a very sportive way. At the same time, he didn't get them budgets. He really pushed them to the corner, saying, if you're not going my way, I'm really going to struggle you with budgets and allowing you to use, even not allowing them to use their foreign currency savings that they had, because it was by law, you had to have the approval of the government back then. But eventually, they made the conflict public. It was published in some important newspaper, and eventually they found the midway, and the midway was Givat Ram. So Givat Ram was becoming the site of the future Capitol Hill, where all the government offices and the future Knesset was supposed to be. It was just in the middle of what became West Jerusalem, mostly unbuilt. And on one of the hills in this area, eventually the government, especially the planning authority, said that's the best site for the future campus. So on one hand, it's a nationalized area, which is affiliated with the government, so it's good for the Ben Gurion approach as the national university. On the other hand, it's still in the city, between how they defined it in the papers of university, between the two neighborhoods of the intelligentsia of Jerusalem, Beit HaKerem and Rechavia. So that was a solution that served both sides.
Throughout these years, even as the university's center of gravity shifted to the new Givat Ram campus, later named after Edmund J. Safra, the original Mount Scopus campus remained, abandoned and unreachable, perched behind enemy lines. It became a demilitarized Israeli enclave inside Jordanian territory, guarded by a small contingent of Israeli police and watched over by UN observers. Once every 2 weeks, convoys would brave the road to bring supplies and personnel up to the isolated mountaintop. Historian Dr. Yair Paz knows the story of Mount Scopus well. He explains that even as the university built a new campus in the west of the city, its leaders were determined not to lose what remained of the mountaintop, especially the beloved National Library. Through 19 long years, until East Jerusalem was recaptured, they evacuated books from Mount Scopus and even found creative ways to reinforce the enclave's defenses, all under the noses of the Jordanians and the UN.
But they said, okay, let's start taking books down from the National Library. A convoy goes up with some people. We'll take books down. Now those convoys also brought up kinds of candies on the roof of the bus. They smuggled up parts of machinery, parts of jeeps, all kinds of things. Throughout those 19 years, they tried to bring in weapons in various ways to strengthen Mount Scopus's ability to hold out against a surprise attack. So they brought up weapons however they could, but they did start taking down books. And that was per an agreement. An agreement was signed to remove a certain quantity of books each time. There was an agreement between the State of Israel and the UN. The UN was in charge of that area. With the Jordanians' consent, of course, they started taking down a certain quantity of books by truck each time. The intention was to take down most of the library, but there was also nowhere to transfer it to. They say some of the books went to the professors' own homes, and some of them never returned later. Anyway, there were all sorts of people involved. You know, going up to Mount Scopus, lots of people miss Mount Scopus. The so-called policemen, who were actually IDF soldiers in police disguise, would go up, and some maintenance people went up. And there were some folks who, using connections, said, listen, Yossi, I'm a maintenance worker. Let me join the convoy. They put his name down, and he went up there. Then he started wandering around. Some people, unfortunately, took advantage of that to do bad things.
Despite occasional mischief, the Mount Scopus police, quote-unquote, managed to safeguard the abandoned campus and its treasures as best as they could. But the university's heart remained broken. Professors and alumni longed to return to their original campus, even as it fell into disrepair under military supervision. Then, in June 1967, everything changed. The Six-Day War erupted, and in the span of just a few days, Jerusalem was reunited under Israeli control. For the university, it meant that the gates of Mount Scopus were flung open at last. Yair Paz recounts how, even before the war had fully ended, university leaders raced up the mountain to reclaim their old domain.
The
war in Jerusalem was over, but things were still sensitive and dangerous. Still, they get there. And even while battles on the Golan Heights were continuing that Friday and Saturday, the leaders of the university arrived, and the most urgent thing for them was to hold a ceremony. Like saying, look, we're here, we've returned to the university's buildings. This didn't happen by accident. It happened because a spring had been ready for release for 19 years. That's how I see it.
A spring coiled for 19 years, suddenly released. That Friday, as bullets still flew on distant fronts, Hebrew University's flag was raised once again on Mount Scopus. After 2 decades, the Hebrew University finally went home. The following week, administrators wasted no time planning the return.
אז אמרנו יום שישי, טקס, יום ראשון.
So, as I said, Friday, the ceremony. By Sunday and Monday, they already convened the construction committee with David Amiram, and they set a plan. Who will return to Mount Scopus first? They literally scheduled which units would move. First of all, there was a planned building for the Truman Institute that was supposed to be built at Givat Ram. They said, take that design as is, transfer it, and put it at the spectacular edge of Mount Scopus. That's where the Truman Building stands to this day. You can go up on its roof, and there's an amazing view.
ואכן הוא גם נראה כזה קצת כאילו תלוש
Granted that building looks a bit out of place, a little detached from the style that the architect Resnick and Aryeh Shachar later carried out in the Mount Scopus master plan, blending historic buildings with the new. But urgency was the priority, so they said number one, Truman, number two, the law faculty, which was a unit that could be moved on its own. That wouldn't disrupt things because law students study only law. They wouldn't need to split their time between two campuses.
In the months and years after 1967, more departments and schools returned to Mount Scopus, and new buildings rose alongside the old stone edifices that had stood empty. With the return completed in 1981, the university was whole again.
The view from Mount Scopus is made possible by American Friends of the Hebrew University. Established in 1925, AFHU has provided over a century of partnership and support to Israel's leading institution of higher learning. To learn more, visit afhu.org.
When the Hebrew University was founded in 1925, its name carried a bold vision. This would not be just a university in Hebrew or for the study of Hebrew. It would be a Hebrew university, using the language itself as the medium of higher education and research. My colleague Tal Kraoz spoke with Professor Elitzur Barasher Siegel, chair of the Hebrew University's Department of Hebrew Language, to hear about the past, present and future of Hebrew at the Hebrew University.
I think it's sort of safe to say that that first generation of scholars at the Hebrew University, professors, people who were eventually teaching their classes in Hebrew, none of them had ever, as students, experienced a class in Hebrew. And so what were sort of like the roadblocks to turning that into a reality?
So I think there was a tension. From what we know, 7 years into the university, people say, oh, they don't really know Hebrew. No one here really know Hebrew. And that was an issue for many, many years. But this was, as the vision was, it actually was the reality that they worked on it. So they actually founded committees to translate the terminology, to create books. So actually in the first 50 years, we see more efforts to create books in Hebrew, to create terminology in Hebrew. So it wasn't like immediately from 0 to 1 that Hebrew was the language, but we see a very strong effort to create the terminology. There were committees in the first years for botanic and agriculture. These were the first two committees. And then they had, in the 30s, they started to have big committee together, which was called the Vaad HaLashon, which is the original thing that developed
the academy,
with the Academy of Hebrew Language. And they had these committees together to work on terminology, to work on helping teachers. So there were this idea that some of the teachers actually had translators with them in classes. So it was an effort, and it took decades until it was clear that this is the language. And I think only in the generation when the faculty members were actually alumni of Hebrew University, the stability of Hebrew became stronger.
But back in the 1920s and 30s, insisting on Hebrew was nothing short of revolutionary. We asked Elitzur if there's any precedent for what the Hebrew University did, essentially taking a language that hadn't been a vernacular and making it the medium of a whole modern university.
Well, I think at the end of the day, no. There are some parallels, but this is really a unique history.
Mm-hmm.
Although I would argue that this is not really happened. So I don't think there was the idea of revival is a little bit misleading here, especially actually in the context of research and in academia. The phenomena of going back to a dead language is not there. On the other hand, the phenomena of changing the language in the academic life, this is something that we could actually see in the history and also nowadays. So I would say the fact that universities stopped teaching in Latin and moved to their vernacular was something, in a sense, that has some components which are similar because there was a need to adapt the curriculum to a different language and not necessarily having the terminology. So still today, most of the terminology in medicine is in Greek and Latin, even though they are spoken in other languages. So this adaptation to a spoken language is actually something that I would say that's actually the reality what happened after the 30s and the 40s at the Hebrew University. And this type of development is actually similar to what happened throughout Europe in this adaptation to the vernaculars and not teaching anymore in Latin and Greek. And actually nowadays also in Arabic country, more and more countries now stopping having everything in the standard language and more vernacular dialects because of this challenge that they had, the gap between the academic language and the spoken language.
The son of Professor Moshe Bar Asher, a towering figure in Hebrew linguistics and once the legendary president of the Hebrew Language Academy, Elitzur initially intended to study physics. But fresh out of the army, a summer course in philosophy drew him into the humanities and tempted him to follow in his father's footsteps. His own path shows how the language isn't just a historical saga, but also lives comfortably inside proofs and theorems.
When I accidentally went to academia, to humanities,
Mm-hmm.
I studied philosophy and I studied Hebrew language. I actually didn't study linguistics. Only later on I started studying, doing linguistics. And it's funny, I always say I teach linguistics. I taught linguistics in some important department abroad, but I don't have a degree in linguistics. But the reason I could do it is because when I studied philosophy at Hebrew University, what Hebrew University was very known for some generation was the study of philosophy of language and specifically logic. And so my degree in philosophy looked like logic 1, logic 2, advanced logic, formal logic. In the 60s, there was an attempt, or there is an attempt since then, to actually treat natural languages as a formal language and to try to see what are the structures or what parts of the language can be formalized in logical way that can explain different phenomena about languages, can explain different formal aspects, how we draw conclusion, how to understand each other, how do we actually make inferences from statements in a logical way. And for this, there is a need to formalize the language, to represent the language in a formal way. When I'm doing linguistics, some of the work that I'm doing is of this regard. I would give two examples. One is less related to Hebrew language, but one is more general. So in natural languages, we have a lot of expression that denote causation. So if I say, John opened the door, we don't know what John did. What we know that he did something, and the result was that the door was open. Unlike when we say John ate, that we have a description of what John did. What we know is basically that he did something that caused the opening of the door. How do we know that this sentence is true? So for this, we actually have to formalize the concept of causation that is relevant to the language. And we can construct what we call a causal model that is, we think, the cognitive ability that stands behind our ability to actually make statements like John opened the door, and what make these sentences true or false. So this is actually a logical conception, but this is what I'm developing in the last few years. And just recently, a very long paper was accepted to, it's going to be published in the journal Linguistics and Philosophy, because it's a very fundamental work of how we represent causation and what makes this statement true or false. This is one aspect. The other aspect that I'm doing, so I'm also at the Hebrew language department, and I study the history of languages. And part of what I'm trying to do is I'm part of a group of scholars around the world that would do what we call formal diachronic semantics, which is a way that we try to actually see what can we learn from the development of languages that can help us to actually understand the meaning of different expressions. Now, when we think about it, it shouldn't be this the case, because the history is not relevant to how we actually compute and understand language nowadays. But what I'm trying to do is to show that when we study the history of language and we see how certain expression develop from one expression to another, so I will just give one example. I would give the example in English, but it's actually what I did was in Hebrew and in Semitic languages in general. If we take what we call reciprocal expression, like one another, so when we say they saw one another, we have the expression one and another, but somehow we understand it that each one of them saw the other. And this is actually a puzzle. How do we understand this meaning? And what I did, and I'm not going to explain it in detail, but what I did, I actually checked all the expression throughout the Semitic languages that evolved to have this meaning of this reciprocal meaning of each other or one another. And in Hebrew we have ish ve'achiv, a man and his brother, ish ve're'eu, a man and his fellow, this and this, ra'u ze et ze, they saw this and this. Echad ve'echad we have in biblical Hebrew. In modern Hebrew we have echad et hasheni, one the second. And I checked it throughout the history of all the Semitic languages, and I tried to actually understand what are the logical characteristic of this expression and how they evolved to have this meaning of each other. And I tried to solve a lot of puzzles about this expression in all languages.
In the early days of the Hebrew University, it played a major role in instilling Hebrew as the language of the fledgling Israeli nation. But once that goal was achieved, and Hebrew was brought back to the community of national languages, it can also be subject to research in comparative linguistics and other theoretical fields. What initially worked in practice can now work in theory as well. One remarkable example of modern linguistic innovation at the Hebrew University comes from an unlikely pairing, a mathematician and an archaeologist. They teamed up to study ancient Hebrew inscriptions using algorithms borrowed from ecology. It is a project that bridges thousands of years, applying cutting-edge data analysis to names scratched on pottery 2,700 years ago. What can that possibly tell us? As it turns out, a whole lot about life in the biblical kingdoms of Judah and Israel. I sat down with Barak Sober, a mathematician, and Mitka Gulub, an archaeologist, to hear about their project.
The project is about analyzing the archaeological findings of names from ancient Judah and Israel. We're talking about the first temple period. And using algorithms from biodiversity, ecological studies, actually, to understand social patterns in the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah and compare them. So it's more of a comparative study, trying to compare patterns of diversity in these kingdoms throughout time.
How does ecology feature in?
So the analog is the following. In ecology, you have species and you have number of individual specimens. So you want to understand the diversity of an ecological system. You want to know how the specimens are spread over the different species. The analog to that, so a name could be the parallel to a species. In our case, we even took the roots. So Netanyahu, Netanel, Yonatan, for us are all the same. It's Natan. And so we take only the root, this is the species, and then we count the number of occurrences of each species. So now, instead of looking of a diversity of, say, a population of birds, we're looking at the diversity of population of names, how the findings, they come from either inscriptions or seal impressions and stuff like that. So how these findings spread across the different species. And we identify interesting patterns in these ancient societies, and we identify different patterns between these societies and across the time.
Mitka, what are the sources that you're working with?
The sources I'm working with are names from epigraphic findings, but excavated artifacts. So it's nothing from the antiquities market, because we would like to understand the context, when these epigraphic findings were found, where, Judah or Israel, and then we would like to make sure that their authenticity is certain. So we pick up the names from all these epigraphic artifacts, and I created a big database with all these names and their characteristics.
Can you give us a rough idea of the period we're talking about and what's so special about it?
Well, we're talking about the First Temple period, or Iron Age 2. We're talking about from approximately the 10th century BCE, which is David's time, to the end of the First Temple period, which is the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, and it's 586 BCE.
And why do we need to know about names specifically?
Names have a very big advantage. Not like the biblical texts that we have, they tend to be less influenced by the author agenda and his beliefs. Names are names. So they, I would say, we can get more information and more truth information.
Authenticity.
Authenticity, from these names than from the narratives in the Bible.
In other words, people might fudge a written history, but they don't generally lie with the names they give their children. The names unearthed from ancient Israel and Judah carry clues to cultural identity, to religious belief, and even social structure. So what have Barak and Mitka discovered by applying ecological diversity methods to these names? Barak gives one striking example.
So one interesting pattern is that the kingdom of Israel is significantly more diverse than the kingdom of Judah. That is one finding. When we compare contemporary findings using Mitka's fascinating data sets. By the way, she didn't say that, but she collected this through many years. It's not like it's a very large project that she runs. So when we compare the kingdom of Israel to kingdom of Judah, contemporary 8th century data, we're looking at the diversity, and we see that the diversity of the Israeli kingdom, the northern kingdom, is significantly higher. What else is that we find that most of the diversity in naming patterns in the kingdom of Judah comes from the capital, from Jerusalem. Whereas in Israel, most of the diversity comes from peripheral sites, not the capital. And this indicates a different society in many aspects, because the people that are recorded on these names are not, they're not the common peasant, right? They carry names. It's another property of names, why to deal with names. It's not the commoners. It's people of high stature, right? So these people, we find their names more spread in the northern kingdom than in the southern kingdom.
There's a big change during that time in Judah. We can see that many names include Yahwistic elements with Yahu and Yah and Yo. And you can see that Yahwism was spread towards the end of the time of the kingdom of Judah. And that goes along with it. When you have a stronger identity, then you see less diversity in names.
Does it say anything about the religiosity or the types of rituals that took place? What is Yahwism exactly?
The only thing we can say is that more people carried names with the Yahvistic element. We can't tell about the rituals for the names. There are other evidence in archaeology that temples that we see, the remains of temples, that's where we can learn.
So what do you make of that concentration of Yahvistic names?
The Yahvistic God became more and more central in Judah, and it became part of the people's identity. Basically, we can't say that it's still monotheism, but it's one phase before that.
Ancient Hebrew inscriptions studied with tools from ecology and data science yield revelations about biblical era culture, patterns of writing, naming, claiming, that whisper across centuries. If you listen closely to what people chose to carve into stone, you might learn what it says about how they saw themselves and each other. 100 years ago, the founders of the Hebrew University envisioned an institution that would be, as its name proclaimed, Hebrew, not just in the sense of being a Jewish national university, but literally a home for the Hebrew language reborn. Over the past century, that vision has been realized beyond what they could have imagined. The Hebrew University and the Hebrew language grew up together, each shaping the other. Today, if you pause for a moment on the bustling Mount Scopus campus, you might hear half a dozen different languages, the chatter of international students and visiting scholars. But underpinning it all is Hebrew, the language that was reborn, in no small part, on this mountain. That's all we have time for today. Thank you for listening to The View from Mount Scopus. Many thanks to executive producer Tal Kraoz, technical producer Leo Peleg, Cliff Saverin, Anu Politis, the Hebrew University's Division for Advancement and External Relations, and its American friends. If you liked what you heard,